Prince of Persia: The Sands of Time was a massive hit for Ubisoft, and of course, when you've got a hit, you have to strike when the iron's hot to capitalize on that. So, as soon as Sands of Time was finished, the team went back to work to follow it up. The sequel had to be bigger, do more, be flashier, play smoother, and just be better like any good sequel should. But it was originally going to be something very different. The original concept was going to have the player not play as the prince, but as an assassin who was one of the prince's bodyguards. In this prototype video, you can generally see what the plan was. You do a lot of the same standard Prince of Persia style gameplay, but mix in some stealth stuff to complement it. Walk around town, blending into the crowd, using hidden blades to take out specific enemies, etc. When I said that Prince of Persia inspired Assassin's Creed in my last video, I was lying. Assassin's Creed wasn't inspired by the Sands of Time, it was going to be its sequel. But as time went on, it differentiated itself more and more, and was eventually spun off into its own franchise. A franchise that would end up being far more successful than its originator, for better or worse. But the team still wanted to create a second Prince of Persia game, and they decided from the start that it would have a much darker tone, and have a much more gothic fantasy influence rather than the Sands of Time's Arabian and Indian influences. And just over a year after the Sands of Time, Prince of Persia: Warrior Within was released. As I said in my previous video, I didn't know anything about this game aside from the box art going into it, and by that metric it wasn't looking too good. It was the standard angry guy looking straight ahead on a dull background box art, you know the type, and I figured I knew what I'd be getting into with that and skipped it back in the day. But I'm older and wiser as far as you know, and I'm a bit less likely to judge a book by its cover. I've got to see what it's actually about before I make my judgments now. That being said, I have a pretty low tolerance for over-the-top edginess. I tend to bounce off that stuff pretty hard. Even when I was a teenager, I was never really into it that much. I was a Nintendo kid, and that shaped a lot of my media habits. But times have changed, and I'm willing to give this game a fair shot, so hey people, it's ScionVyse, and let's take a look at Prince of Persia: Warrior Within. At the title screen here, you see pretty much nothing interesting. Yeah, there's no novel concept with the intro this time around. That's not necessarily a bad thing though. Sands of Time just had a really unique setup that enabled the game to do what it did with its menus. Warrior Within doesn't have that, so it does make sense that the intro and menus would be much more straightforward. We start with an opening cutscene where the prince is being chased down the streets of Babylon by a strange, dark sand creature. The creature corners him and the prince readies his blades, which he does not actually use in that way during the main game. Then we immediately cut to the prince on a boat. The ship is being attacked by another vessel, and after an incredibly unnecessary shot, thanks for that by the way, the game begins. We get our tutorial section on the boat here, which teaches us some of the prince's new moves. But this is all basic tutorial, and our goal right now is to stop the attack. The prince eventually reaches the woman who is leading this attack and... Whoa, calm down dude. Really trying hard to stretch that M rating, huh? Anyways, I played on normal difficulty, and one of the things I noticed is that a lot of this game's early boss encounters are really hard. Like, you probably don't even know how to use most of the prince's normal moves at this point. And the first boss, Shoddy here, pulls no punches at all. She has loads of health, hits really hard, and has some attack patterns that definitely aren't befitting a tutorial boss. I may just be bad, but I had more trouble with Shoddy than I did with any intro Souls boss. Anyways, Shoddy kicks the prince overboard, and we learn about why he's on this mission. By using the dagger and unleashing the Sands of Time, the prince has altered the timeline, and that has attracted the attention of the beast known as the Dahaka, keeper of the timeline. The Dahaka is chasing the prince for surviving his fated death, So the prince is heading to the Island of Time to see if the Empress of Time can be convinced to not create the Sands of Time, eliminating his transgression. The prince wakes up on the shores of the Island of Time and sets off on his way to find the Empress and either convince her to not make the sands or kill her if she refuses. As soon as we are on the island, we're free to move around and make our way towards the palace. The prince more or less feels the same in terms of control here, which makes sense. He's still able to run along walls, climb up pillars, swing from bars, etc. He's got a few new ways to get around too. There are ropes that he can swing on, and there's tapestry that he can use to either slide down from, as well as jump off of. These both feel right at home and are both used extremely well here. The platforming is arguably more fun than in Sands of Time as well. These new mechanics help vary up the whole experience, and since the team had a whole game under their belt at this point, they were able to do a lot more with each individual part, leading to more complex, interesting, and fun platforming sections. The prince's time powers return as well, but have received several significant tweaks. Since the prince no longer has the Dagger of Time, he can't stab enemies and freeze them in combat anymore. But since he has Farah's amulet, he still has control over time. Two of the prince's main abilities from the previous game, Rewind and Slow Down, both return. Rewind has been renamed Recall, and for the most part it's the same, except you can rewind the full amount of time regardless of whether or not you've used other powers, which is a welcome change as that led to many unfortunate deaths in Sands of Time. Slowdown has been changed to Eye of the Storm, and it's basically the game's defining ability now. Instead of slowing everything down, which was largely useless aside from vaulting over certain enemies, it slows everything but the prince down. Not only that, but the slowdown lasts far longer as well. This makes it far more useful in combat as enemies are more vulnerable in general, but the prince is far safer. There are others as well, but they're far less important, like unleashing a flurry of attacks when time is slowed, or blowing enemies away that are near the prince. To balance all these new abilities out, the amount he can use of each power has decreased. In Sands of Time, you had up to 10 uses by the end of the game. In Warrior Within, the max you get is 6, and you start with 1. This means you have to be much more careful when you're going to use your time powers, as you'll run out of sand much quicker. And since the prince's journey through the Island of Time is no less treacherous, you could end up dead really quick. The game's level design philosophy has also been heavily changed from Sands of Time, with Eye of the Storm being a significant contributor to that change. Because you're basically always expected to be able to slow down everything around you, the developers were much more liberal in the placement of traps and obstacles, and were much less forgiving in their patterns. The spiked poles and saw blades that crawled along the walls and floors of Sands of Time are practically sprinting here. Everything can be passed without slowing time down, but that resource really allowed the developers to make the platforming much more challenging, and I love that. On top of that change, the overall structure to the game has seen a significant shift. Sands of Time was a very linear adventure. You go from area to area, and once you pass through, with a few exceptions, you'll never be back to anywhere you've been. Warrior Within completely scraps that entire idea. Once you're in the Palace of Time, it's much more open. There is a linear path at the start until you get a weapon called the Serpent Sword, which is used to open up all the other areas. There are two sides of the palace that you have to travel to and activate mechanisms in, and you can tackle each side in whichever order you want. Obviously, there is a suggested path, and taking the other will make the game harder on you, but the option is available. And these areas loop in on each other, so when you finish doing what you need to do, you end up right back where you started in the palace's hub area. This more open design does mean that you'll be more likely to get lost exploring though, and thankfully, the game does give you a map. This is the map. Does this look useful to you? Me neither. Yeah, I don't even know why they included a map, since this gives no useful information at all. You can't really tell where you are or where you need to go or even how to get there. It's arguably one of the least useful maps I've seen in games. Not having it probably would have even been better, as you wouldn't waste your time trying to read it. I do like the more open design overall, map uselessness excluded, and this does change how certain aspects of the game, like HP upgrades, are handled. HP upgrades were a nice to have in Sands of Time, but they're much more important in Warrior Within. You can beat the game without having all of them, but if you want the good canon ending to the game, you have to collect all of them. Because of this fact, all the HP upgrades are in areas of the palace that you can return to at basically any time, and none of them are permanently missable. The HP upgrades aren't given out in the same way as in Sands of Time either. In Sands of Time, as long as you could see the path to the upgrade, you got it. Now they're all given to you after you succeed in a difficult platforming challenge. They're still hidden away in parts of the world that you'd have to explore to find too, so it's a double whammy, and I really like that. Now, while this game takes place in one area, the Palace of Time, it doesn't take place in one time period. You reach the Island of Time in the present, but the vast majority of the game actually takes place in the past, which you get to first by stepping into one of these portals. The past is where you'll be doing most of your puzzle solving and exploration, as everything is in working order and is more populated with enemies. A lot of the present is explorable as well, but since the palace is in disrepair, it's not as traversable. What the game does to liven these present sections up are chase sequences. Ooh, I love a good chase sequence. A few times throughout the game, mainly in the present, you'll be doing what you do, jumping around, exploring, when the Dahaka will appear out of nowhere and chase after you. The screen color changes to a dull sepia, dark tentacles break out of the walls, and the camera moves to focus on the Dahaka. These are really fun, and while there are enough of these to get the most out of them, they don't really wear out their welcome, and at the end of every chase, you'll usually find yourself at a portal to the past, beyond a waterfall that the Dahaka can't pass for some reason. So yeah, so far it's actually looking pretty good. The platforming mechanics are improved, the level design is far more non-linear and open-ended, and even things like the HP upgrades are much more integrated into the core gameplay. It's not all great, however, and there are a few blemishes on the game. Ironically, one of the things that drags the game down a bit is one of the things that the team spent the most time prioritizing and revamping: the combat. When you start the game and are just getting a hold of the controls, you may think that the combat is very similar to the previous game, but it's a completely different beast. The Prince has so many new options for combat that it's basically impossible to list all of them in a reasonable time frame, so I'm just gonna condense a lot of it. His main attack isn't too different, the actual animations and combos are different, but it works identically. No, the complexity comes from the fact that there are 2 buttons for attacking now. Since the Prince doesn't have the Dagger of Time, there's an entire button free for different things. And man, the developers put as much as possible on that button. When you just have the Prince's main sword, the second button acts as a grab where you can do a bunch of different things off of. You can throw enemies, you can execute them, you can move around with them, and most importantly, you can steal the enemy's weapons. Yeah, you can steal enemies' weapons from them, and when you do, you'll dual wield them, giving you lots of new combos and attacks. And considering there are dozens of weapons in this game, many of which do share movesets admittedly, you can probably already see how deep this rabbit hole goes.
Put me down.
On top of giving the Prince a new moveset for the weapon on its own, you also get a bunch of new weapon combos that utilize both at the same time, based on what buttons you press and when. It really makes fighting enemies and bosses more interesting since you can have so many more options when fighting these enemies. These weapons will eventually break, leaving you back to just your original sword. But if you're going to be choosing to fight a lot of enemies, I generally think it's a good idea to snag one whenever you can. But when exploring, I generally just choose to yeet guys off cliffs. It's easier and faster when backtracking. This actually brings me to one of, if not the biggest issue with this game's combat. Since the player could be going through each area multiple times, they couldn't have the same structure as Sands of Time. If the enemies didn't respawn, there'd be no threats at all when backtracking. However, if the Prince was forced into combat each time, it'd get very tedious very quickly. The compromise is that the Prince really isn't forced into combat anymore, outside of a few specific boss encounters. On one hand, this allows the prince to travel through these areas multiple times fairly unobstructed, which really helps with the exploration. On the other hand, since there is no direct reward for battling enemies aside from getting charges for sand powers, it can make standard combat encounters feel kinda pointless. The enemies themselves don't really help that feeling either. They aren't bad necessarily, and thankfully Warrior Within doesn't just reuse any of Sands of Time's enemies, which usually happens with these direct, somewhat rushed sequels. However, a lot of the enemies aren't that interesting. There are a few mini-bosses like this bird guy and the big golems, but aside from that, there is a pretty small number of enemy types that offer very little variety. The enemies kinda just end up being things that show up and don't really contribute to the combat flow. And that's one thing that I think Sands of Time does better than Warrior Within in terms of combat. There was a flow, a rhythm to the combat, and the enemies were a large determining factor in that. Warrior Within just straight up doesn't have that. The combat mechanics themselves are so much more smooth and fluid, but the enemies don't feel like they were designed with any sort of flow in mind, just as obstacles for the prince to come across and stab every once in a while. This makes the combat as a whole feel less cohesive. Bosses are a similar story where they're cool and fun to fight, but aren't really designed around the prince's abilities. Some bosses boil down to slow down time, attack, and repeat until they're dead. Ironically, the more the prince's capabilities grow, the less he has to bother with any of them. The difficulty curve is kinda angled in the wrong direction. For instance, remember Shoddy, the first boss of the game? Well, she's also probably the best too. Since you don't have all your time powers, you don't really have a crutch to make her easier. It's a shame that the other bosses weren't really designed to give a player any sort of challenge if they were using the time powers properly. As great a power as Eye of the Storm is, it really ends up breaking the boss fights. So I guess it boils down to the combat being pretty good when you don't have to use it and kind of underwhelming when you do. I do like what is here, I just wish it was a more concrete evolution over Sands of Time instead of 2 steps forward and 1 step back, you know? Now the visuals are a clear evolution from Sands of Time. There's way more variety in the areas you move through, and they generally all look pretty good. The character models are definitely improved over the last game as well. Faces are still not great, definitely better than the Sands of Time models though, so I can't complain too much. I don't really have much to say about the visuals, honestly. The graphics themselves are improved, and overall the visuals fit the darker tone of the game. Just like, good enough, I guess. And now it's time to move on to sound. Bear with me on this one, but what does Stuart Chatwood, Enon Zur, and Godsmack all have in common? If you said not much aside from being musicians, you'd be right, but interestingly enough, all 3 of these artists were involved in Warrior Within's music. Chatwood wrote the game's OST just like Sands of Time, Enon Zur composed the score for the game's CGI cutscenes, and the song I Stand Alone from Godsmack's 3rd album plays not only as the game's ending theme, but as the Dahaka's chase theme in an instrumental form. The game's OST is still pretty good as well. It leans really hard into the guitar rock side of things, and I do generally like that. It goes really hard with the bass, and I do love me some good bass. But it does know how to dial things back, and the Arabian influence isn't completely gone. My favorite tracks this time around are Struggle in the Library, At War with Kylina, and Military Aggression. The sound design is fine as well for the most part. Nothing really stands out as amazing. Well, aside from the mixing, it kind of stands out as an issue, especially with a few of the enemy screams. They're like way too loud relative to the rest of the game. Aside from that, it's alright. Nothing too special, but nothing too awful either. With that out of the way, it's time to talk about the story. Warrior Within definitely has a lot more going on in terms of story compared to Sands of Time, at least in terms of its plot. But before that, I'd need to talk about the prince himself, because if I didn't already know, I'd have thought these two guys were completely different characters. In Sands of Time, the prince was a wisecracking, confident guy who would talk to himself and spoke like a nobleman. He was a fun character. Obviously, he didn't have a history of strife or violence, but was willing to jump into battle for honor or glory. In Warrior Within, to say that the prince has a chip on his shoulder is basically the understatement of the century. For a good portion of the game, he's broody, angry, bloodthirsty, and just overall miserable. I understand that the Dahaka has been chasing after him, trying to kill him for several years, but come on. They even switched up voice actors for the prince in this game, the only game in the modern franchise where he isn't voiced by Yuri Lowenthal, instead being voiced by Robin Atkin Downes. He does a decent enough job with what he had, but this basically solidifies the idea that this prince is basically a different character from the rest of the series. So where we left off in the story proper, the prince was making his way to the Palace of Time in order to prevent the Sands of Time from being created. When he makes his way in, he finds Shadi and another woman fighting. The prince still isn't a bad guy, so he rushes in and saves the woman from being killed by Shadi. After this battle, the woman tells the prince that she works for the Empress, and reluctantly, she tells him what he has to do in order to meet with the Empress. The prince has to activate two switches on opposite sides of the palace to open doors to the Empress's chambers. She gives the prince the Serpent Sword, which opens up the paths to the rest of the palace, and the prince is on his way. After some puzzle solving and Dahaka chases, the prince activates the towers and the path to the Empress is clear. On his way, this guy attempts to attack the prince. This thing has been following the prince around the palace, and we don't really know why. He's never really been all that threatening, and he's rarely been directly aiming to hurt the prince, but he's always just been there. But regardless, when he appears this last time to fight the prince, the Dahaka appears and grabs it, dragging it down into the chasm below, for some reason. The prince and the woman then make their way to the throne room, and she locks the two of them inside. As it turns out, this woman, Kylena, is the Empress of Time, and she was attempting to sabotage the prince on his way. And since that plan failed, she takes things into her own hands to kill the prince. After a boss battle, the prince does what he came to the island for and kills Kylena, exploding into sands. With his job done, he heads back to the present to leave the island and head back to Babylon. But on his way back, he gets chased by the Dahaka, which shouldn't exist, and falls down into the palace's depths. Unbeknownst to the prince, all the actions he took to this point weren't actually going to prevent the Sands of Time from being made. In fact, he was instrumental in their creation. In killing Kylena, she became the Sands of Time. This is the first major plot hole. The Dahaka is chasing the prince for breaking the timeline, but if the prince didn't use the dagger, the Sands of Time wouldn't exist. It's an origin paradox. The Sands of Time wouldn't exist without the prince, but the prince wouldn't take the actions required to create the sands without the sands already existing. That being said, I will let this one slide, as there is a chance the sands would have been created regardless, even if the prince wasn't involved. In the depths of the palace, the prince comes across a mask and an inscription that effectively tells him that he can use the mask to get a second chance. Rewind time to before all this happened and prevent the bad outcome. Donning the mask, the prince turns into the Sand Wraith. Yeah, that weird guy that was following the prince around, that was the prince using the mask to try to alter the fated timeline. At this point, we basically move through the game as the Sand Wraith, who constantly drains HP but also constantly recovers sand. We experience the same events as the prince over again, just as the Wraith, until eventually we meet the prince in the palace again. This time, instead of the Dahaka taking the Sand Wraith, he grabs the past prince, allowing the prince to take his previous form and change the events that had transpired.
Created a time paradox.
Okay, I can't really let this one slide. This is a major paradox. We've already seen this scene, and we know that the Dahaka takes the Sand Wraith, not the prince. Nothing in this previous section has changed to suggest a different branch in the timeline. The prince is just doing everything that the Sandwraith has already done. And there's no real remedy to this either. We kind of just have to deal with the fact that everything past this point just ignores a huge time paradox that was created. So with the Dahaka taking the former prince, the current prince regains his form and sets out to change how things played out. He tries and fails to convince Kylina that he isn't going to kill her, so he goes to plan B, which is to kill her in the present, which would alter all of the previous events. However, in the present, the Dahaka finds the prince and Kylina and attacks them. This is where your collection of HP upgrades comes in. If you have found all of them, you will have gotten the water sword, and if you remember how the Dahaka can't contact water, you should be able to see where this is going. If you haven't found the water sword, however, you'll have a final boss against Kylina, but for my playthroughs I did, and the Dahaka is our final boss. With the water sword you can finally hurt the Dahaka, and it's time to take it out for good. This fight is actually kinda lame. Once you figure out the Dahaka's moves, you can really easily cheese it out, going for quick hits and abusing your time powers to make it a really quick and easy fight. After the final blow, the Dahaka falls into the water and is destroyed, freeing the prince of his pursuer and letting him get back to living a normal-ish life. He convinces Kylina to join him and they leave the island. So they head back towards Babylon, and when they arrive, they find the city in flames, being ravaged by battle, the prince realizing what his actions have done, changing the timeline and dooming Babylon. So that was Prince of Persia: Warrior Within. I really enjoyed my time with this game overall. It's not better than Sands of Time, as there are quite a few areas where I feel it took a few steps back, but if they toned the edginess and gritty anger down a few pegs, what this game established with its gameplay could be something genuinely great. Obviously, I don't like the prince himself very much here, and the overall tonal change was not for the better. They really tried way too hard to push the M rating, and I don't think the game benefited from that. However, if they reeled that in and gave people a reason to actually fight regular enemies and made combat more inherently fun, it'd be an absolute masterpiece. I can only hope that happens at some point in this series. Next on the docket is Prince of Persia: Two Thrones. From what I've read, Ubisoft tried to marry the tone of Sands of Time with the gameplay of Warrior Within for this one, and if they manage to pull it off, man, I'll be super happy. I'm really interested to see what they did with that one. So with that, I will end this video. Hope you enjoyed it. Thank you very much for watching, and I'll see you all later.